Here lies all that remains of the Liberty ship James Egan Lane, torpedoed by a German submarine during the Second World War. In those dark days, submarines were strangling the lifeblood of the Allies, and the seabed around the British Isles were littered with their rusting victims. The shipping losses were enormous, and with the prospect of starvation hanging over every meal, the German submarine campaign came close to bringing Britain to the brink of surrender. Churchill once famously said that the only thing he really feared was the submarine. But it wasn't always so. When submarines first stole upon the scene, they were unanimously condemned as being both underhand and the spawn of the devil. But war changes many attitudes, and here in the sleepy village of Southpool, deep in the South Hams of Devon, the parish church contains a small memorial to a wartime disaster that was to change the face of naval history and propel the submarine into the forefront of the war at sea. Just after the outbreak of the Great War, on the 12th of September 1914, Midshipman Froude, aged just 16, was serving on board the battle-cruiser Cressy, which was sailing in company with the cruisers Hogue and Aboukir in the North Sea. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Otto Weddingham, in command of the German submarine U-9, came into contact with the battle-cruisers and sank all three in under an hour, causing the loss of over 1,100 officers and men. For the Royal Navy, it was the greatest loss of life since the Battle of Trafalgar, and brought home to them the terrifying reality of submarine warfare. From that day on, the submarine became the most feared weapon in the war at sea, and as the years rolled on, its power and destructiveness increased with every advance in technology, until today's submarines, like this Trident sailing into Plymouth Sound, have the capacity to destroy our world and every living thing in it. The first practical class of submarine to enter into service with the Royal Navy was the Holland in 1902. This submarine had been invented by John Holland, an Irish-American engineer, who basically gathered together all the best ideas from other submarines and with his engineering genius welded them all together into a submarine that was reliable. With a stroke of inspiration, he then armed the vessel with a Whitehead torpedo, providing the submarine with the capacity to strike unseen. For 13 years, the Hollands gave the Royal Navy good service, but as can be seen from this preserved example of Holland 1, the very first Royal Navy submarine, they were not the sort of craft to inspire confidence. Inside, the hull had no watertight bulkheads, and for a crew it was extremely cramped, as the whole hull was devoted entirely to the workings of the submarine, leaving them with precious few comforts. An 18-inch torpedo tube took up most of the bow, and the rest of the space contained the engines and batteries. By the time the Hollands had started their service, the A-class was already being designed. They were to be the Royal Navy's first all-British boat, and were a joint venture between the Admiralty and Vickers Maxim. The A-class was to be 40 feet longer than the Holland, at around 105 feet, and have two torpedo tubes arranged side by side in the bow. The submarine was to be powered by a petrol engine capable of developing the then unprecedented amount of 550 brake horsepower. Although they were to be an improvement on the Hollands, they had a number of design defects, and as a result the A-class suffered an inordinate number of fatal accidents, with the loss of at least 58 men in the run-up to the outbreak of the First World War. Although many of the fatalities were caused by petrol and battery explosions, or suffocation due to petrol fumes, the most common cause were collision and the submarine's inherent instability due to a lack of a sufficient reserve of buoyancy. The ever-present danger of collision was illustrated by the sinking of the A1 in March 1904, the Royal Navy's very first submarine disaster. With a hull just underneath the waves, the submarine A1 was carrying out a mock torpedo attack off the Nab lightship when she was struck a glancing blow by the liner Berwick Castle, which sent her straight to the bottom, killing all her crew. The sinking of the A8 a year later gave a timely reminder about the lack of reserve buoyancy in this class of submarines. Launched on the same day as the A7, the A8 already had a reputation for being unstable and used to frighten her crews by diving without warning. On the 8th of June 1905, she was on manoeuvres in Plymouth Sound near the breakwater when she started an uncontrollable dive. Water flooded in through the open hatch, and later the batteries exploded, killing 15 of the 19 crew, some of whom were still only trainees. The whole of Plymouth was stunned by the tragedy, and thousands turned out to line the route of the funeral procession. By a dreadful coincidence, the A8's companion on the day that she sank was the A7, and although she didn't know it at the time, she had just witnessed an event that foreshadowed her own demise. As the accident rate increased, questions about the safety of the A-class began to be asked. Throughout the service they became known as Coffin Ships, and it was increasingly difficult to get volunteers to serve on them. The inquiry into the sinking of the A8 unmasked a blinkered and self-serving Admiralty to a furious public. For instance, the coroner had asked Captain Bacon, the chief of the submarine service, if he found it difficult to recruit ratings after such a disaster. The answer by Bacon that these disasters only increased the flow of recruits into the service left the coroner almost speechless with astonishment. This rather arrogant answer was symptomatic of attitudes throughout the Royal Navy, which stemmed from the fact that Britain really did rule the waves and its navy was the envy of the rest of the world. It had been unchallenged for nearly 200 years and a certain amount of complacency had set in. The general public looked upon the navy as its sheet anchor, allowing Britain to do exactly as it pleased almost anywhere in the world. Without its protection, Britain's trade and empire would have crumbled, and because of this politicians deferred to the Admiralty far too much and considered that they were the source of all naval wisdom. However, the Navy was very set in its ways, relied heavily on its long years of supremacy, and had an absolute horror of any new ideas. All this changed in 1902 when Admiral Fisher became the second Sea Lord. Independent thought or action had long been discouraged, and officers' higher education within the Navy was a disgrace, with teaching methods and subjects being far too out of date. Fisher set up 2 naval colleges, Osborne in the Isle of Wight and here at Dartmouth in Devon, to correct that. Another problem he faced was the dreadful state of the Royal Navy's gunnery. The old methods of instruction, using just a book, were discarded, and future gunnery efficiency was achieved by practical methods, like actually trying to hit a target, and the development of gun director fire. He did not forget the ordinary seaman either. Conditions on the lower deck were still very poor. Flogging had only been abandoned 25 years before, and desertions still ran at about 10,000 a year. Fisher immediately realised that if the men were unhappy, then their fighting efficiency would suffer. To this end he improved the food rations, even ensured that they had cutlery to eat with, and modernised ship sanitation and ventilation systems. This was all to be just in time, as when Fisher became First Sea Lord 2 years later, he would usher in the age of the Dreadnought, a super battleship that at a stroke made all other ships obsolete, and started a naval arms race that found its ultimate expression at the Battle of Jutland. Little did Fisher realise that his beloved dreadnoughts would themselves be made obsolete by a class of vessel that the Navy only had on sufferance, the submarine. It was against this background of a radically changing Navy that the tragedy of the A7 was about to unfold. The A7 was built by Vickers, Sons and Maxim at Barrow-in-Furness and was laid down on the 19th of February 1909 and launched nearly 2 years later on the 23rd of January 1905. She was 105 feet long, nearly 13 feet in the beam, with a draft of 10 feet 8 inches. To drive her on the surface, she had a 16-cylinder petrol engine, which developed 550 brake horsepower, a colossal amount for those days, and gave her a top speed of 11 knots. For underwater use, she had a 225 horsepower electric engine, which gave her a top speed of about 7 knots submerged. The range of the A-class submarines on the surface was 325 miles at full power, but underwater this shrank dramatically to just 20 miles at 6 knots. To achieve all this, the engines needed 7 tons of petrol, which effectively made them floating bombs. The large petrol engines were notoriously unreliable, and with all the problems of petrol fumes and the risk of explosions, the Navy was forced to pursue other options. Eventually they secured a license to manufacture diesels, and by 1908 more and more submarines were equipped with these engines, leaving the dangers of petrol far behind. With their short hulls and low freeboard, the A-boats suffered from a lack of seaworthiness. With only a tiny reserve buoyancy and a very low conning tower, the boats were far from suitable for the short steep seas around the British Isles. Except in calm weather, the submarines were practically blind when submerged and immobile on the surface. Longer sea passages, especially in poor weather, had to be covered by towing the boats with all openings closed, with the crews subject to great discomfort and hardship. Because of their unsuitability to make any sort of extended sea passage, the A-class were used mostly for harbour defence and stationed at Portsmouth and Plymouth as part of the 3rd Division of the Home Fleet. The A7 was attached to the Devonport training flotilla, and after the A8 disaster she continued her training duties around Plymouth. In view of what was to happen, it may be significant that whilst the crew of the A7, with the exception of Sub-Lieutenant Morrison, were all experienced submariners, most had not been attached to the boat for more than 3 months prior to its sinking. The captain, Gilbert Molesworth Wellman, had served in submarines for just over 4.5 years, and the A7 was his first command. Aged 27, Wellman had just recently inherited the Trwythydic estate in Cornwall after his aunt, Lady Molesworth, had been fatally stung by a wasp. Although he took command of the A7 in November 1913, 3 months before the disaster he had been on sick leave for several weeks with a damaged knee, which didn't leave him much time to get to grips with the crew or the boat. Wellman's second in command was Sub-Lieutenant Morrison, a keen rugby player. But he had only been appointed to the A7 on the 4th of December, barely 6 weeks before the fateful event, and it was his very first submarine. The coxswain, Petty Officer Crowley, was arguably the most important crew member after the captain, and although very experienced, he had only just joined the A7, and on the day it sank, it was only the second time that he had ever set foot inside the submarine. All in all, the crew had a lot to learn, and Captain Wellman had already had a taste of how difficult the A7 could be. Just before the Christmas of 1913, Wellman had been exercising the boat in Whitsands Bay when it had suddenly dived without warning and hit the bottom. He tried to blow the ballast tanks, but the gear malfunctioned, and he and the crew spent a hectic hour with the auxiliary pumps before he was able to bring the boat safely to the surface. One of the crew on board at the time was Leading Stoker Wagstaff. He had already had one lucky escape when he was transferred sick from the submarine B2 12 hours before it was run down by the liner America with the loss of 15 of her crew. If that wasn't bad enough, a few days after the Whitsands incident he had his arm badly crushed by a hatch. It was no wonder that he confided to a friend that he thought his luck was running out and that he might go for a dip in the A7 just once too often. On the morning of the 16th of January 1914, the A7 left Devonport in company with the A9 and 5 other submarines for exercises in Whitsands Bay. They were accompanied by the depot ship HMS Oinks and the gunboat Pygmy. These 2 ships would act as targets for the submarines that would exercise their skills in carrying out mock underwater attacks. Whitsands Bay was a favourite location for these exercises because the seabed was largely free of rocks and there was much less opportunity of submarines surfacing and colliding with other vessels. There was a stiff northeasterly breeze which made the water quite choppy, and a thin mist hung over the bay. All in all, the conditions were quite favourable, and the visibility in spite of the mist was considered to be sufficient. As the flotilla came around Rame Head, Lieutenant Wellman, in charge of the A7, found he was being left slightly behind, and as the exercise started he took up his position about 2 miles to the east of where he should have been. The A9 carried out her attacks on the Pygmy, who then recovered her practice torpedoes and made ready for the next part of the exercise with the A7, who was waiting with her hull awash ready to dive. The Pygmy started her run at 11:10, steaming away from Rame Head into Whitsands Bay. It soon became clear that the A7's attack had failed, so the Pygmy set back along her course to find out where the A7 had got to. At this point nobody felt any cause for concern. But by 11:55, when there was still no sign of the A7, the captain of HMS Pygmy started to get worried, and proceeded to carefully search the area. At 12:15 a lookout suddenly saw a disturbance on the surface of the water. The captain shaped a course towards this, and 3 minutes later he saw a second eruption of bubbles on the water about 3 miles west by north from Rame Church. The presence of so many bubbles on the surface must have sent a chill through the watching ships, and although they redoubled their efforts to try and find the A7, they could no longer ignore the inevitable. A very serious accident had occurred, so the pygmy dropped a marker buoy where she had seen the bubbles, and at about 2 o'clock left the scene and raced back to Plymouth to report. The Navy galvanised itself into action, ordering 2 tugs to tow salvage lighters to the scene. By 3 o'clock the pygmy was leading the charge back to the scene, where it confidently expected to find the buoy, hook onto the sub and release the crew. As the pygmy rounded Rame Head and sped towards where she had left the A7, the crew competed with each other to be the first to spot the buoy. The A7 only had a few more hours of air left, and the buoy had to be found fast. The light, although fading, was still good, but nobody could see the buoy. The captain ordered tugs to search further over in the bay, and the crews searched till their eyes ached, but no sign of the buoy was ever seen. As darkness fell, the search had to be abandoned, and with it any hope that the 2 officers and 9 crew from the A7 were being rescued alive. The next day word quickly spread that a submarine was lost, and groups of relatives and friends of the crew gathered at the Admiralty buildings in Mount Wise to hear the latest news. The Navy were not willing to release any facts, since they were still coming to terms with the disaster themselves. However, that did not stop the newspapers from revealing all, or just making it up. One local newspaper got completely carried away and insisted that the vessel had been located, that the crews were alive, and that the communication had been established via the use of a telegraphic buoy. If only. The sad truth, however, was that the A7 only had enough air for the crew to last 6 hours, and the search had gone way beyond that. The Navy now needed to find the submarine, not to save the men, but to find out what had gone so terribly wrong. All weekend the Navy searched, dragging wires along the seabed in the hope of snagging the submarine. Hopes rose briefly when one set of ships snagged an obstruction, but divers soon proved that it was just a huge rock, and not the ill-fated submarine. As the weekend came to an end, the A7 still eluded its searchers. Messages of sympathy were sent from the King and Queen, and others came from the heads of government around the world, including the Emperor of Germany and the President of the French Republic. There was such a public sense of shock and sympathy that disaster funds were set up in Plymouth and Portsmouth. On Monday, 4 days after the A7's disappearance, Commodore Roger Keyes, chief of the submarine arm, took personal charge of the search and decided to sweep the whole of Whitsands Bay from Rame Head down as far as Loo Island. For this task he used 6 pairs of destroyers and 6 pairs of torpedo boats. Each pair was equipped with their own sweeping gear. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and the easterly winds became bitterly cold, so that the job of sweeping the bay became a real test of endurance. Commander Hamilton, who was in charge of the torpedo boats, stayed on his open bridge all day in the freezing wind in a vain attempt to find the A7. When he finally withdrew to his cabin, he was fatally chilled, caught pneumonia, and was found dead in his bunk the next morning. As dusk settled on another fruitless day, people began to believe that the submarine would never be found, and questions started to be asked about the Admiralty's attitude to submarine safety. Many wanted to know why the A-class of submarines was still in service when they were so obviously out of date and had been swiftly superseded by classes of submarine that made the A-class look positively primitive. Another bone of contention was the apparent lack of suitable dedicated salvage craft. The Admiralty only had 6 submarine salvage tenders dotted around the country, and only one of these was capable of lifting over 400 tons. Only a few months before, the submarine C-14 had been successfully lifted from Barn Pool by lighter 94, but that had had to come around from Sheerness nearly 200 miles away. Although this would not have had any bearing on the A7's situation, many thought it displayed a lack of planning by the Admiralty, especially as it was in the process of expanding its fleet of submarines at an accelerated pace, which incidentally is probably why the A-class was kept on well past its sell-by date. The need for submarines, any submarines, to carry out training must have been tremendous. In letters to the local papers, the point about the absence of a marker buoy was made several times. In 1911 in Germany, the submarine U-3 was on an exercise in Kiel harbour when for some unexplained reason water started to pour in through her ventilator shafts and she sank. She was equipped with a telephone buoy which came to the surface so that the crew could tell those above the water that they were safe in the forepeak, and they were soon rescued. A similar event happened to a Russian submarine in 1913, and if the A7 had been issued with the device like later classes of submarine, then at least the boat could have been found more swiftly, and maybe, just maybe, some of the A7's crew might have been saved. It all smacked of penny pinching, and the Admiralty was roundly criticised on all sides, especially by the foreign press, who had latched onto the phrase "Coffin Ships" and used it at every opportunity, so much so that in the end Commodore Keyes was forced to issue a robust denial and insist that the A-class were as safe as any other class of boat. Meanwhile, Germany had offered the use of one of its huge lifting barges to help with the salvage operation. This generous offer, however, was politely refused on the grounds that the Navy knew perfectly well what it was doing and didn't need help from anyone. It was a decision that was to come back and haunt them. As dawn broke on the 22nd of January, the search had been going on for 5 frustrating days, and the crews of the flotilla of search ships were beginning to lose heart. As the sweeping continued, there was a brief moment of hope as another obstruction was found, but when the divers reported it to be another rock, gloom descended upon the search party. As the day wore on, there were other false alarms, but nothing to give the weary crews the faintest glimmer of hope. Suddenly, with the light starting to dim, a signal was received from HMS Pygmy. She was steaming about 4 miles off Rame Head in the approximate position where the A7 had sunk when her lookout spotted an oil slick. The Pygmy immediately put down a marker buoy, and divers were rushed to the spot. At last, there in 138 feet of water lay the A7. The Navy's search was finally over, but its troubles were just beginning. When the news broke that the A7 had finally been found more or less where it had been seen to sink, it sparked a storm of protest at how ineffective the Navy's search techniques had been. The Navy retreated behind a wall of injured silence and attempted to deflect mounting criticism by revealing its plans for the swift raising of the A7. The very next day at first light, a fleet of salvage vessels sped to the scene where the Pygmy still guarded the buoy marking the A7's grave. Divers had found the submarine in about 138 feet of water, with her stern embedded in 22 feet of mud, with the rest of her hull sticking up at an angle of 35 degrees. The idea was to place a hawser underneath the hull of the vessel and then tow the submarine free. This was attempted during the afternoon, but after all the tug's efforts, the divers reported no change. The A7 was still firmly stuck in the mud. By now the weather had worsened with a big groundswell, so salvage attempts were abandoned for the weekend. The battleship Exmouth made the next attempt on the 27th of January. A 5-inch hawser was shackled to the bow plate of the submarine by divers, and the other end attached to the battleship's mighty winches. In the event, the hawser fractured the submarine's bow plate, and water started to pour into the submarine, making lifting her even more difficult. With a view to gathering data for the official inquiry into the A7 disaster, a similar craft, the A5, was taken out to Spithead and submerged with all her crew to what the Navy said was a considerable depth, but in fact was only 60 feet, well within her safe range. Once on the bottom, the officers and men worked the hand pumps that were the same as those fitted to the A7 and took the place of the electric pumps in an emergency. The A5 rose to the surface a short time later without any difficulty. What this proved was debatable, as it had been a very controlled experiment, and certainly did not replicate the uncontrolled diving for which the A-class was notorious. It took nearly 3 weeks for the weather to abate, and on the 17th of February the Navy made another failed attempt to pull the submarine out of the mud. By now the whole effort to salvage the A7 had become an exercise in damage limitation. The Navy was being crucified on all sides for their inefficiency, questions were being asked in Parliament, and the press were publishing highly critical editorials. The whole episode was becoming a huge embarrassment. In the end, the decision was made to have one last attempt and then abandon the A7 to her watery grave. 10 days later, the Exmouth and all the other craft gathered to have one last try. Wires were slung around the A7 and capstans took up the strain. All day the work went on, but to no avail. The A7 was well and truly stuck, and there she and her crew would have to stay. So what happened? Why did the A7 sink on that fateful day? Before the notes of the official inquiry are examined, it is necessary to look again at the problem that made the A class of submarines so vulnerable, their pitiful lack of reserve buoyancy. The A class were developed from the original Royal Navy Holland submarine and consisted of a single skin pressure hull with all the ballast and buoyancy tanks carried internally. There were no watertight doors or any partition of the boat whatsoever, so if any water got in, then it could go almost anywhere, especially into the engine compartments. The ballast tanks would provide the major buoyancy for the submarine when empty. These tanks were flooded pre-diving to allow the boat to run awash with just the conning tower exposed. At this stage in the diving sequence, this separate buoyancy tank provided 600 pounds of reserve buoyancy that kept the submarine afloat. 600 pounds might sound a lot, but it's only 60 gallons, not much more than 2 large dustbins. Any water entering the boat at this stage would be very serious, as even a small amount was enough to submerge the boat without warning. As the A-boats tended to pivot around their centre of gravity when supported by this tank, the usual practice was to run the submarine with a stern-down trim of about 6 degrees, because when heading into sea, wave action could easily force the submarine's bow down and thereby cause an uncontrolled dive. By 1914, to dive a submarine from surface trim was relatively simple and well practised, though it was still considered a dangerous procedure in these obsolete craft. The boat would have its ballast tanks flooded to bring her awash, with her conning tower just above the surface. The petrol engine would be stopped, and the electric motor switched in. The hatches and ventilators would be shut, and the stern planes would drive the boat underwater. If all was well, and the electric motor was stopped, the submarine would rise to the surface due to the effect of her buoyancy tank and its 600 pounds of lift. At slow speeds, however, the stern planes would probably not exert enough effect to overcome the buoyancy tank, so it would have to be partially flooded to achieve neutral buoyancy, thus reducing the submarine's reserve buoyancy even further. But even in this condition, the boat could still surface by moving forward and using its planes to drive the boat to the surface. The buoyancy tank was then blown clear with compressed air to resume surface awash running, and the ballast tank was also blown to bring the submarine as high out of the water as possible. All in all, it was a tricky business, which called for fine judgment from the crew. On the day of the A7's loss, the notes for the official inquiry state that the A7 was meant to have been in this position, where the water was only about 90 feet deep. However, due to a delay in getting to the exercise area, Lieutenant Wellman was late on station and 2.5 miles to the southeast of where the A7 was supposed to be, and in water that was nearly 150 feet deep. This was a crucial error. The American version of the Royal Navy Holland, the Adder, had been depth tested and found to be unsafe around 100 feet. The A7 was developed from these designs and was basically a stretched version. Although being a larger vessel, it is not known whether she was built with correspondingly stronger materials. If she wasn't, then it follows that she would have been weaker than the Hollands and even more susceptible to damage from excess depth. The notes from the inquiry show that in order to carry out an attack on the Pygmy, the A7 would have had to head her bows into the choppy sea. She was seen to submerge awash, and when she disappeared it was assumed she was getting ready to start the attack. However, with the propensity of these crafts to dive while running awash, it is fairly certain that her bows were pushed under by the waves before Lieutenant Wellman and his crew could shut the hatch and dog the vents. Even if she was only making 5 knots, the A7 was still covering the best part of 10 feet per second, and as she was pushed under, she would have taken a huge amount of water on board, far more than the 60 gallons of her reserve buoyancy. Not having had the time to exercise and train together for desperate emergencies like this, the crew would have been overwhelmed with the horror of a rapidly filling boat. Frantic efforts by the crew to surface the boat would have only ensured a bows-up attitude, which would have allowed any water in the boat to rush to the stern, destroying any trim that she might have had left and flooding the engines. As the water gushed in ever greater quantities, the submarine would have sunk faster and faster, and as it passed near the 100-foot mark, it is possible that her internal ballast tanks gave way, causing even more water to pour into the stricken boat. Such was the speed of the A7's descent that when she hit the bottom stern first, 22 feet of the submarine were buried deep into the mud. By then all her crew would have been dead. After a brief moment of horror, they would have faced merciful oblivion. On the morning of March the 6th, 1914, a score of vessels, including several submarines headed by the cruiser HMS Forth, assembled 1 mile south of the Mewstone to form up for the burial service that was to be conducted in Whitsands Bay. On board the Forth were the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir John Egerton, and a number of relatives and friends of the crew of the A7. In 2 columns, the ship slowly proceeded around Ramehead and on to the buoy that marked the grave of the A7. When the burial service had been read, the Royal Marine Guard of Honour fired 3 volleys over the grey silent waters, and as the echoes died away, a small boy, the only son of engine room Artisiver Nagel, threw a wreath of flowers onto the water that marked his father's last resting place. Far below in the silent deep, the A7 rests on her bed of silt, cradling the memories of her gallant crew. There is no other memorial to these brave men, so the area has been proclaimed a forbidden zone so that none may disturb their rest.